Hello, comrades. Welcome back to the third session of our class on fascism and global class struggle. And so thank you once again for your commitment and your consistency and with being with us for the third Saturday in a row. That's heroic. So we just want to thank you all for your commitment and consistency to this collective process of study. We're going to be covering fascism and the police state today. And so I'm sure we're going to have a lot of thoughts and questions. And so without further ado, Gabriel, thank you.
Great. It's wonderful to see everybody, and thanks for your persistence and continued interest in this theme. I did want to take just a moment because I was able to touch base with Claudia and some of the others who have been doing a lot of the important behind the scenes work, just to kind of clarify what the central goal of this course is. This is in part because, and I think justifiably so, there have been a number of questions about what's the party's position on fascism, what tactics are we using now, should we use in the future, etc. And there have, of course, been some statements made by leadership about the January 6th riot in particular. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that the goal of this course is really to provide resources in a collective fashion so that we can all continue to work through the question of how has fascism manifested itself historically, what does the contemporary scene, particularly in the United States, tell us about fascist threats, and then also to develop some concepts with real use value so that we can begin to make sense of this particular landscape. And one of the great things, of course, about both party work and communist pedagogy is that since this is a collective endeavor, we can draw on all of the resources that we have. Obviously, Claudia has just done that in sharing with us, not only in this session, but in previous sessions, some of the wonderful cultural production that is oriented towards anti-fascist organizing. There's a lot of tech intelligence going on behind the scenes, as you know. And then Brian has graciously agreed to come in for the last session in order to address much more directly the question of the party's current position on fascism, and also has agreed to make himself available for the kind of final Q&A that we'll have. And so if you do have really pressing questions about kind of PSL's position, it's great that Brian is going to be able to address that, particularly as well, because as I'm sure a lot of you know, Brian has years of experience in the struggle, literally decades. And so not only has a theoretical understanding of these things, but has been engaged in and working with a lot of the organizations in the US context and internationally. And so it's wonderful that he will take time out of his schedule in order to share those that insight with us. The outline that I've shared with you, like last time, is just kind of the skeletal framework of what I'll present. But if you look at it, don't get intimidated because the skeleton is much larger than the skeleton last time. One of the reasons for that is some of the material I assume most people will probably be generally aware of, so I might go over it relatively quickly. And also, if we don't get through the whole outline, we'll have time to return to some of these issues next time. The last thing that I wanted to say before diving in is that there have been some requests for the precise references to particular quotes and whatnot. And as much as I can, I've provided those. All of my books, except for the ones you see behind me, are currently in boxes. So some of them I don't have access to, but I've done my best, and don't hesitate to reach out if there's a resource that you really want to get your hands on. Now, as far as the recap from last time, I'm going to be very quick on this, but there are a few things that I think are important to foreground, and also just to clarify in relationship to some of the discussions that we had in the chat and the feedback we had about the class. One is the specificity of the kind of united front tactic. And as I outline in the Google Doc that was shared with you, this was the platform of the World Congress in 1922. And the idea of a united front is that you would bring together those who are on the revolutionary left, communists, socialists, anarchists, in a kind of common struggle against the bourgeoisie's backing of fascism. And as we saw last time, this included as well a reference to illegal methods. It's not exactly specified what this means, and probably rightfully so, because it was a document that others could read. But it's important as well to identify that the United Front, as well as these illegal methods, this is a defensive tactic, right? It's not a strategy for completely abolishing fascism. It's a way of keeping it enough at bay that we as organizers or as communists can have room to develop the type of work that we want and need to develop. The United Front, though, also took on a slightly different form as of 1924, and that was the idea of a united front from below, where instead of working primarily with leadership and organizations, as well as some workers who weren't in parties and organizations, there was an attempt to actually divide the social democratic base by radicalizing the revolutionary left side of that base and incorporating it within the anti-fascist orientation. And so this logic of a united front from below is, let's focus on the rank and file, because of course, as we saw last time, the Comintern accused the leadership of maintaining a position of so-called social fascism, right? Where the Social Democrats were accused of not only aiding and abetting fascism, but ultimately, they say quite clearly that it's more or less a fascist project. The other thing that I wanted to note was that in 1935, when particularly after the instigation of Dimitrov, the United Front was kind of expanded into what's called a popular front. And the idea with a popular front is that it wouldn't just be the revolutionary workers, but also some centrist and potentially liberals who would be incorporated within a common defense of the gains under bourgeois democracy in order to keep the capitalist ruling class from just imposing the direct dictatorship of capital via the fascist tactic. And so what this did, of course, is it expanded the kind of the framework, if you will, of the front against fascism beyond just the revolutionaries, and to include as well certain sectors of the who were closer to liberal or centrist positions. Now, one of the things that Brian pointed out in a call that we had with Claudia that I think is really important is that, of course, there's the document of the Seventh Congress, but then there's what this actually meant on the ground for activists in the global communist movement. And here I'm more or less paraphrasing Brian. He pointed out that in the wake of the Seventh Congress, what this meant was that the Comintern was calling for communist parties globally to unite to fight the right while taking revolution off the table. And so the concrete consequences of this were really a kind of orientation that was a defensive tactic that also had then implications for a lack of a kind of clear focus on the kind of actuality of revolution. Right, the CPUSA would be a kind of clear manifestation of that, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about other such manifestations. The two other things that I had on the board just from last time very quickly is that the United Front Against Fascism that was established by the Black Panther Party in 1969 was a united front that included a whole series of organizations on the radical left. But one of the focal points, and I think this is important for beginning to articulate some of the things that we'll look at today, was on the police state, more so arguably than on vigilante networks like the black shirts or the brown shirts in the cases of classic fascism in Europe. And so I've included in the handout a quote from Huey Newton that I think really goes to the heart of this. Newton said that, quote, "The Black Panthers have never viewed such paramilitary groups as the Ku Klux Klan or the Minutemen as particularly dangerous. The real danger comes from highly organized establishment forces, the local police, the National Guard, and the US military. They were the ones who devastated Watts and killed innocent people. In comparison to them, the paramilitary groups are insignificant. In fact, these groups are hardly organized at all. It is the uniformed men who are dangerous and who come into our communities every day to commit violence against us, knowing that the laws will protect them." End quote. One of the things that's interesting about this, of course, is we've been talking about the relationship between parastate fascism, or fascism as it exists in vigilante organizations that are parallel to the state, versus state-centered fascism, right? And in Germany and Italy, there was a process by which these fascist bands were eventually integrated into the state. One of the things that the BPP was critical of is the extent to which the US state apparatus had already centralized a lot of this kind of control over the repressive apparatus, and so advocated for a united front that had to be against the police force and the military. And of course, there's anti-imperialism that is built into this particular position. The last things that we saw as far as tactics are concerned from last time was the idea of a revolutionary commune that we saw in the case of Jackson. And I take it that one of the reasons I want to highlight this is I think it overlaps with a lot of our own neighborhood organizing and community organizing, in which one of the goals is to build infrastructure for workers in which there is not only space, but networks of communication and community that allow for a kind of neighborhood synergy that carves out space for a mode of interaction and a set of kind of local tactics that are a very powerful force against the encroachment of both the repressive state apparatus and parastate actors like vigilante fascists. To give a shout out to one of my comrades in Philadelphia, Timur, one of the things that he claimed is that the most important thing we can do in fighting fascism in a city like Philadelphia is to really shore up our contacts to the local community so that everybody recognizes that we are the vanguard of the revolution and that we have the best interest of the working people in mind. And that is a key element in tactics for struggling against fascism in the contemporary era. Now, turning to kind of new material for today, I wanted to start just by framing three elements in relationship to US history. And I'm going to be very quick on this because I imagine most people are relatively familiar with this. It's common to claim that the United States is a democracy, but we should know, of course, that it's not. It wasn't founded as one. In fact, it was explicitly founded as a republic. And the so-called founding fathers undertook a kind of ideological campaign against the very idea of democracy. And the threat that they saw in the state constitutions prior to the Constitutional Convention and the establishment of the Constitution of the United States is that the state constitutions were too democratic. Right? And so when the US Constitution was signed in Philadelphia, the form of government that was established for the US and US states more particularly was a republic. And a republic, in the jargon of Enlightenment thinking, is a form of governance in which there are an enlightened few who govern over the majority, meaning that it's an oligarchy or a rule of the few. And people like John Adams pointed out why this was so important, because he highlighted the fact that if the United States was founded as an actual democracy and there was power given to the people, the very first thing that the people would want is the land and the wealth of the ownership class. And so they would immediately demand breaking up estates and getting access to what the ownership class possessed. And therefore Adams, along with Hamilton, along with the other Federalists, as they were referred to, argued for the need to maintain democracy at not only at a distance, but to establish a republic that was explicitly an anti-democratic republic. As you might know, of course, when the Constitutional Convention was held, there was a debate about maybe making the president just appointed for life and other such things. But the final decision was that the only positions of political power that would be voted for would be the House of Representatives, but that there would be qualifications that were set by the state legislatures that excluded women, the indigenous population, slaves, and also required property holding qualifications in order to be able to vote, right? And the Constitution provided for senators to be elected by the state legislators, for the president to be elected by electors, and for the Supreme Court to be appointed by the president. So at all of those levels, there was no democracy, and this was explicitly so. What happened in the case of the United States, though, is in the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson was running for president, they ran a PR campaign in which they presented him as being a man of the people, a man of the demos. And so he presented himself as being a Democrat, meaning that he was, of the local population. And then slowly but surely, the US ruling class began referring to the mode of Republican rule as democratic, while never actually changing the institutional arrangements of power that are integral to the oligarchy as it was founded. Now, of course, over time, there was class struggle from below, very important class struggle from below, that led to such things as the Bill of Rights, the abolition of slavery, except for in conditions of punishment, the eventually an expansion of the franchise, and a lot of other things that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. But that was the result of class struggle from below. One of the other things that I think is important to know is that geographically, the United States has never been a bounded landmass. It has always been an ever-expanding capitalist empire of states, territories, colonies, and neo-colonies. So the map that most people have in their mind when they think of the United States, the kind of contiguous 50 states, or maybe Hawaii and Alaska, that original map only represents 3 years of US history. And it expanded across the West and kept expanding ever since, and continues to do so with 800 to 1,000 military bases around the world. That's important to recognize, because then when you analyze the United States, you don't only think in terms of, well, what are the modes of governance of this bounded landmass that is purportedly the United States, but instead you understand that the US is an imperial force to the core, and you take that into account in your account or of your way of making sense of fascism. Because of course the whole question is, how are populations actually governed, right? Not simply what does the state say that it is doing and how it's governing its citizens or the population in a particular landmass. The last thing I'll say quickly, and I'll return to this a little bit later on, is of course, one of the founding myths of the contemporary world is that the United States defeated fascism in World War II and established the kind of grand democratic world of the contemporary, that we're familiar with in the contemporary landscape. The history of Western liberal democracies, though, is one of not only aiding and abetting the rise of fascism in certain ways, but also avoiding actual support for left-leaning governments. In the Spanish Civil War, this was the case on the part of the United States, as well as other liberal democracies in Europe. And then, as you probably know, the overwhelming majority of the Nazi war machine was targeted against the Soviet Union. In fact, 80% of the Nazis that died in the war were killed on the Eastern Front, where 27 million communists gave their lives fighting fascism. And there were 400,000 American soldiers who died in the Western Front, which was microscopic. It was 1.5% of the Soviet death toll. And so the idea that the United States, saved the world from fascism or other such things, I think gets a lot of that history wrong. It's the Red Army that defeated the Nazi war machine and was marching west. And it was recognized on the part of the US ruling class that there needed to be an intervention in the war for those reasons and for some others as well. This is also, I think, important because when we think about World War II and then its consequences, it is essential to recognize that wars need to be analyzed from the point of view of class struggle, not simply from the nation state ideology that tells us that the US was allying with these other states against, Germany and Italy and the Axis powers and whatnot, because what that writes out of that history is how the capitalist ruling class often functions in deep complicity over wars between so-called nation states, which basically send workers as cannon fodder, and they profit from that through the permanent war economy. This is also, though, important, this perspective, in order to push back against what I refer to in the handout as the kind of bourgeois concept of fascism, in which, if it be the Holocaust industry, bourgeois social science, the mass media, there's an overwhelming tendency to particularize fascism as an absolutely exceptional phenomenon that thereby dissimulates its structural and systemic characteristics, as well as the actual material forces that tend to drive its growth in particular conjunctures, like the political economy of the capitalist world system in the early 20th century that was a driving force behind the rise of the Nazis and the Italians. One of the other reasons I think that this is important to put up front is that this bourgeois concept of fascism tends to lead to a kind of ideology of fascist exceptionalism. in which what the bourgeoisie tends to do is it overinflates its purported positive traits and says that we're democratic, we're the defenders of democracy. In fact, they invent all of these myths about how democracy goes back to the origins of the Western world. And all of these are mythological constructions that began around the late 18th, early 19th century, but then became really consolidated in the 20th century. And one of the things that these myths do is then they also particularize any of the negative aspects of capitalist rule, right? So democracy is overextended and overexpanded, where fascism is whittled down to a tiny kind of exceptional occurrence. And in many cases, people claim that, well, it only happened in Germany, it only happened in Italy, it couldn't possibly happen in the United States. There's something so American that is like recalcitrant to these types of things. I think you probably are all familiar with this kind of general logic as it has operated within the mass media, at least. In seeing through then the bourgeois concept of fascism, as well as its perception management, right? Which also means that fascism is often read only through the lens of how it manifested itself in Germany and Italy. And so people will say, well, it can't be fascism because it doesn't mirror exactly what happened in Germany or exactly what happened in Italy. And I think that if we relate some of the things that we've been talking about earlier to the kind of the concern of this particular class, one of the things that we pointed out is that good materialist analysis will always have an account of its scale of analysis, right? So you can abstract out to a kind of systemic account of capitalism and look at the ways in which there are fascistic threads within the deep history of capitalism. And by fascistic, I should qualify, what I mean is there's overlap with even our working definition of classical fascism. But saying that something is fascistic doesn't mean it's absolutely 100% identical to classical fascism as we've been defining it. It means there's enough overlap that it makes sense to point out the continuities, right? So from a systemic point of view and a materialist analysis, primitive accumulation, the history of capitalist colonialism, has a very clear fascistic thread within it. And we see this within the US settler colony and its imperial expansion that is unending. That fascistic thread, though, of course, is different than how it specifically manifested itself within Germany and Italy. And I'll get to some of those differences in a moment. But if we then look at the structural level of analysis, meaning what was going on in the phase of capitalist accumulation in the early part of the 20th century, the kind of interwar period, and how did that play itself out on the American home front, we see a few things that I think readily should immediately call our attention to the ways in which the idea that fascism only happened in Europe is mistaken at certain levels. The first thing that I'll point out, and you'll see this in the handout, is that the US involvement in World War I, as Woodrow Wilson pointed out, was supposedly to make the world safe for democracy, but what he really meant by that, and this is a quote from him, was to keep the white race strong and to preserve white civilization and its domination of the planet, right? So it's a very clear statement by the President of the United States of a white supremacist, imperialist, pro-capitalist agenda, right? I'm not saying that that is identical to classical fascism. All that I'm saying is that there's enough overlap between those two orientations that we need to mine down into this to see more clearly what's going on. One of the other things that's important in this comparative analysis between Europe and the United States is that the United States was taken as the model, both the kind of legal and to a certain extent political and colonial model for Nazi Germany. There's an interesting book by James Whitman called the American Model for Nazi Germany, I believe, or something along those lines. He's a liberal historian, so there are things that are out of focus, but he does do a good job mining down into the archive and bringing certain things to the fore. like the fact that Hitler pointed out in Mein Kampf that there'd only been one country in the world thus far that had made the advances that got us close to the Third Reich, and that was the United States, in particular because of the US position on immigration, on second-class citizenship, and on miscegenation, right? On interracial marriage and interracial reproduction. So what Hitler appreciated in the United States was its racial apartheid system and its racial statecraft that excluded foreigners and targeted them as people who weren't fully part of the community. This went so far, of course, it's not just Hitler. The Prussian Memorandum of 1933, which basically outlined the Nazis' legal program, specifically invoked Jim Crow, and the National Socialist Handbook of Law and Legislation concluded its chapter on the construction of a race state by acknowledging that America was the country that had fundamentally recognized the truths of racism and taken the first necessary steps toward a racial state that would be fulfilled by the Third Reich. Moreover, when Italian fascism first arrived on the scene, it was widely recognized in the US press that this was a European manifestation of the Ku Klux Klan. And comparisons between the Klan and Italian fascism were very widespread in that period. Langston Hughes, for instance, in 1936, wrote, "Fascism is a new name for the kind of terror the Negro has always faced in America. This kind of terrorism is extending more and more to groups of peoples whose skins are not Black." It's also the case that the Nazi Germany's white supremacist colonial expansion to the East against the Bolsheviks, who were racialized as Judeo-Bolsheviks, as the kind of Slavic hordes and barbarians from the East who were a threat to Christianity, Western civilization, whiteness, and capitalism. That colonial expansion to the East was modeled very explicitly on US colonial expansion to the West. Carol P. Kakel, along with many other researchers, have detailed this. In fact, Hitler was somewhat obsessed with the indigenous, the elimination of the indigenous population, or attempted elimination of the indigenous population in the United States, and what that meant for what was being done in the East on the part of the Nazi war machine. She wrote that the analog of the American West and the Nazi East became an obsession for Hitler and other Nazi true believers. Now, if we look then at another level of analysis and actually begin to identify what were the fascist or fascistically oriented organizations that were operative in the United States in the interwar period, and how do they relate to the Black shirts and the brown shirts that we were talking about in the past? The Klan, of course, is one of the major organizations in the United States. At its highest, it counted 4 to 5 million members. I've put in the outline what people refer to as the 3 different waves of the Klan. Of course, there's continuity between them, and it would be a mistake to separate them out too much. But the Klan was, or is, I should say, a vigilante organization that is white supremacist, obviously. It's also pro-capitalist. It's also anti-Semitic, against the left in general. It is anti-queer. You know, you go on with the list of the kind of ideological orientation of the Klan, and the relationship between the Klan and the other fascist and fascistically oriented organizations that we'll talk about in a little bit is also quite intimate, meaning that particularly in the contemporary iterations of the Klan, there are a lot of Klan members who work hand in glove with neo-Nazi organizations and with fascist organizations. I'm going to go kind of quickly to get into the next few, just because I have an eye on time. One thing that I'll highlight in passing, though, and I think is important in anticipation of how we're going to, what I want to do is give everybody a lot of resources so they can use them to kind of bring into focus what's going on in the contemporary moment. And a lot of the fascist organizations that are currently operative in the United States, of course, draw extensively on veterans and people with military and police experience in various ways. And so I did want to highlight the fact that the three waves of the Klan, many people have argued, relate to the ways in which veterans were mobilized in the wake of particular wars, right? So it was after the Civil War that the Confederate veterans formed the first Klan. It was in the wake of World War I that veterans led the Second Era Klan as being in kind of all-American racial, religious, and nationalist orientation. And the Third Era of Klansmen were composed in part of people who had served in World War II, as well as in Korea, who took kind of leading positions in many ways. So I highlight this as well because of the complexity of teasing out how state power relates to parastate power or to parallel structures like the Klan. Some of the other organizations operative in the United States were the Black Legion. This was an offshoot from the Klan that included some 150,000 people, including a large number of public officials, according to the FBI. The Silver Legion of America was modeled on the black shirts. They numbered some 15,000 people in the mid-1930s. There were also the Friends of New Germany that then became the German American Bund. And this was basically a Nazi organization within the United States that had 5,000 to 10,000 members. The Christian Front is another important organization, particularly because of the extent to which they had access to some, I've seen stats as high as 10 million people who would listen to their the radio programs of Charles Coughlin, who was one of the leaders of the Christian Front and was an outspoken supporter of Hitler and of fascism within the European scene. I've also put the American Legion on here. The American Legion, of course, is composed of veterans, and it had 1 million members in its early years and now has about 2 million members. Alvin Oasley, as I put in the outline, was one of the first commanders of the Legion, and the Legion was regularly inviting Mussolini, supporting Italian fascists, wanting to work kind of directly with and perform acts of solidarity with the fascists in Italy. Oasley claimed that, quote, the American Legion stands ready to protect our country's institutions and ideals as the fascisti dealt with the destructionists who menaced Italy. The American Legion is fighting every element that threatens our democratic government: Soviets, anarchists, IWWs, revolutionary socialists, and every other red, end quote. There are a number of other organizations that are worth knowing about. The American Liberty League, I'll talk more about in a second. The Sentinels of the Republic that were operative in the 20s through the 40s. There were also very large anti-worker militias that were run by big business. If you're not familiar with George Seldes' book, Facts and Fascism, I would highly recommend it. I know some comrades have read it. It's a fascinating view into a lot of the corporate backing of vigilante anti-worker organizations. There's also what Carrie McWilliams refers to as farm fascism in some of her work that points out the brutal vigilante groups that were used to discipline particularly immigrant labor pools in agricultural settings. But I'd like to just, in the interest of time, because I want to try to wrap up in about 5 minutes, relate this to the question of state-based fascism within the United States, because some people would say, okay, yeah, there are these parallel structures, but how's this relate to the actual functioning of the state? I've put on the outline, of course, there are many things that we could point to on the part of the US state in relationship to indigenous people's history, in relationship to the African-American population, US imperialism. That would be a very important part of this discussion. But we should also note that the Palmer raids were orchestrated by the US government and followed in many ways the same orientation of a lot of these vigilante organizations. So it's interesting and I think also important to see certain synergies between state repressive violence and parastate repressive violence. So the Palmer raids took place in 1919 and 1920. They were overseen by the General Intelligence Division of the US Justice Department. And Hoover, the future head of the FBI, was of course directly involved in and one of the key operators in the Palmer raids. What did the Palmer raids do? They targeted 30 US cities, and they arrested between 5,000 and 10,000 anti-capitalist activists, communists, socialists, anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, etc., often without warrants, without evidence, and without trials. What this means, if we look at how both the vigilante organizations were working and these kind of state-based forms of repressive terror, is that there are certainly certain sectors of the US population, like racialized groups, immigrants, workers who sought to organize on the revolutionary left. Many of them, you could not say, had the full liberal rights that the bourgeois state claims that people have within the kind of landmass of the United States. But the last thing that I'd like to highlight before taking a break is that the plot to seize the White House in the mid-1930s is a very important part of this history, and I think also can give us some tools for understanding the contemporary forms that fascism takes. What happened in the mid-1930s is that the major corporate interests, including JP Morgan, the DuPont family, the Rockefellers, the Pews, the Mellon interests, conspired in a plot to abolish the New Deal and establish a fascist government in the United States. This is the vocabulary that they were using, right? It wasn't, and it's also because fascism in the 1930s wasn't quite as faux pas as it is now, so people could say what they were actually doing. What they did then is they hired Gerald Maguire, who worked for a brokerage firm and was one of the founders of the American Legion, who spent 4 months studying fascism in Europe, spent months in Italy, went to Hitler's Germany, and then also spent time in France. And he came back and reported that the best model for fascism in the United States for his corporate rulers was the Croix de Feu in France. The Croix de Feu is a fascist organization composed of non-commissioned officers and veterans. It was some 500,000 people strong in the mid-1930s. Maguire told reporter Paul French, quote, "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down and wreck all that we have built in America." I think that this is also important. There were a lot of questions about what happens to fascism in a context like neoliberal America, in which you don't have the same kind of communist power base that you had in other parts of the world at other parts of other points in time. What's really interesting about this deeper history of the United States is that the demonization of the progressive kind of liberal left or social democratic left within the US landscape is often a demonization of them as being socialists or communists, right? So they're actually identified as enemies of the worst sort. And that's how the New Deal was identified, at least by some of the corporate backers of this particular plot. They had an unbelievable amount of money. They started with $3 million, but claimed that they could get some $300 million. And their plan was to pay the veterans for mobilization. And they'd use the Remington Arms Company, where DuPont owned a controlling interest, to arm the veterans. And so, of course, from the ruling class perspective, this is a pretty easy operation. You just need a bit of money and your business contacts, and you can mobilize an army of veterans of 500,000 people. The plan then was to mobilize this fascist band and pressure the president, Roosevelt, of course, at the time, into accepting a Secretary of General Affairs that was actually explicitly modeled on Mussolini in Italy. And Maguire admitted, quote, "You know, the American people will swallow that. We've got the newspapers." Very important statement, right? That part of this fascist plot was you needed the militants on the ground, you needed the corporate backing, you needed the arms, but you also needed to control the propaganda apparatus, right? So we've got the newspapers. We will start a campaign that the president's health is failing. The dumb American people will fall for it in a second. What ended up transpiring is Smedley Butler, the Major General of the Marines that Maguire approached about leading the veterans, because they wanted a quote unquote man on the white horse. And they approached a number of different people about this, and they ended up settling on Smedley Butler because he was widely respected by the veterans. And they approached him about it, tried to bribe him into accepting it. He heard them out through a kind of long process in trying to figure out himself what was going on. And then he ended up going public and turning his back on his financial backers and blowing the cover on this planned fascist coup. And then all of the coup planners and the US government, as well as the press, turned their backs on him. And I would strongly recommend not reading the Wikipedia page on Smedley Butler or on what's called the business plot, because like a lot of information on Wikipedia, this is mediated by various corporate interests, including one of the presidents of CBS, who's the largest donor to Wikipedia, who himself was involved in a lot of covert operations. And so there's a good book called The Plot to Seize the White House that goes into a lot of this, but it's been corroborated by other sources. And what happened is that the prosecutions, there were no prosecutions of the conspirators. Roger Baldwin, who is the director of the ACLU at the time, explained what happened in the following terms. The Congressional Committee investigating un-American activities has just reported that the fascist plot to seize the government was proved, right? So there was a fascist plot to seize the government. Yet, not a single participant will be prosecuted under the perfectly plain language of the Federal Conspiracy Act, making this a high crime. Imagine the action if such a plot were discovered among communists, end quote. So I think just in the interest of time, I'll kind of wrap up there, but there are other issues that I want to return to after we, in the second part of the presentation, to kind of flesh this out a little bit more.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you everyone for engaging in the chat. That was Dead Press and The Glorious Coup with our boy Riley, Boots Riley.
Okay, great. Welcome back, comrades. We had an opportunity to go through some of the questions and we just chose a few of them. I'd like to try to at least give a few things to think about in response to them. And then I have a second part of the presentation. One of the questions was about the relationship to January 6th. And part of the reason that I wanted to outline the business plot was to give us some deeper historical context, because one of the things that's, of course, very difficult to do in materialist analysis is something new happens and you can't figure out immediately what the coordinates are and what exactly is going on. And there's still a lot that we don't know about January 6th, but having some of this deeper history at least demonstrates how the capitalist ruling class tends to operate, how they control the press, how they mobilize certain sectors of civil society to do their bidding. And I don't think that one can easily parallel these two events and say, well, there's the business plot and then there's January 6th, and that they're just kind of parallel in that regard, in part because there was also a lot of both corporate, military, and national security state backing of Biden. And we'll talk more about January 6th explicitly next time, but I think that, some of the things that we do know are that, this was a conspiracy. Like there are elements of the state that were involved in overseeing green lighting, allowing this to happen. And that there were also a lot of FBI informants who are actually boots on the ground. A lot of the organizations like the Proud Boys and whatnot have a number of ties, including one of the leaders of the Proud Boys is an FBI informant. And so those connections between the state and kind of parastate operatives is important. There's also, and this is how it kind of relates to, or one of the reasons that I wanted to have people watch the documentary on Operation Gladio, is that often the ways in which the capitalist ruling class will orchestrate particular events is also relates to the propaganda campaigns and how those propaganda campaigns can move public opinion in particular directions. And so, that's all that I wanted to say for the time being. Morgan said, how directly comparable do you think the hands-off attitude towards fascistic militias and groups in the US is to the strategy of tension in Italy in the 1970s? One of the things that's interesting about the strategy of tension in Italy, if you're familiar with it, of course, Operation Gladio really goes into this. And if any of you were not able to watch the documentary film, what we have in a nutshell is that the US national security state, the CIA in particular, but working with other intelligence organizations as well, along with MI6, which is the equivalent more or less of the CIA in Great Britain, and local intelligence services within Europe and certain other state elements set up stay-behind armies, right, in order to, and these were stocked by fascists and Nazis. And I'm not saying that in some hyperbolic sense. They're literally people who were fascists during World War II and Nazis during World War II. And then they were used in the strategy of tension to commit acts of terrorism against the civilian population that were blamed on communists. In Italy, this has been extremely well documented, and it went up through the Italian courts, and it was found that there was a conspiracy that went all the way up to the US government. And there was also a European resolution on Operation Gladio calling for the need for additional investigation. So in relationship to the US case, we should know that this came on the heels of Operation Northwoods, and Operation Northwoods was overseen by General Lemnitzer. Operation Northwoods was, in a nutshell, to do the exact same thing in the United States. It was developing a communist Cuban terror campaign that included plans to sink a boatload of Cubans. This I'm quoting from the documents here. Foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees, exploding a few plastic bombs, but they also anticipated hijacking civil air and surface craft, create an incident that will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route to the United States. And General Lemnitzer, who oversaw this in Operation Northwoods, was greenlighted all the way to the top of the national security state. And the one person who said no was John F. Kennedy. He himself, of course, would be killed within a very short amount of time after that. General Lemnitzer oversaw Operation Northwoods that ultimately wasn't greenlighted by the US government, and then became the head of NATO forces in Europe the exact same year when Operation Gladio actually went into action, and there were the first, in the sense that there were the first terrorist actions in Europe that were blamed on communists, but actually performed by fascists. So I do think that there are a number of important continuities between what was going on in Europe and plans, at least within the United States, but also internationally. Katie asked how directly comparable, this is Michael's question about Liberation School publishing something on the business plot. A few people said that they weren't aware of the business plot. It's an important chapter in US history, and I think one that needs to be better covered. And so I do think that we need to explore it more, and we need to also be able to find out what the most reliable sources are on the business plot. Angel asked, often liberals characterize President Trump's administration as enabling fascism. How would we understand that? Fight back against that claim in the context of neoliberalism, et cetera. Again, one of the things that I want to do in the next session, and I'm glad that Brian's also going to weigh in on the party's position on fascism in January 6th, is look more specifically at the US police state in the phase of capitalist accumulation known as neoliberalism, and then how that has affected as well the white power movement that really kind of has developed since the 70s and then took on different forms kind of in the 90s, and of course has taken on different forms under the Trump administration. And one of the complexities, I think, of certain, or I should say one of the complications in certain approaches to fascism is that there's a real obsession with individuals and their particular statements or pronounced ideology, as opposed to looking at fascism as a mode of rule that is orchestrated by the capitalist ruling class, and it will take on different ideological forms depending on the moment. And so drilling down deeper into that, I think will hopefully give us some more insight into Trump's position in all of this and how it relates to right-wing extremism and fascist movements within the United States. There was one final question maybe that I'll talk about briefly. Chance said, once fascists consolidate state power, to what extent are the corporate interests steering the direction of state and national activities versus the strongmen, a la Mussolini and Hitler, and their newly deputized vigilante bands? And how do the contradictions between the interests of the rank and file fascists and corporate fascists affect the material policies of the fascist state? So that's a big question, but I think a really important one, because in a certain sense, and you see this in the business plot, right? The plan in the business plot with the United States was not to pay the veterans their pension for the rest of their life, because that was one of the complaints on the part of the veterans, was that the US government wasn't paying their pensions. And the plan on the part of the plotters was, well, from the corporatocracy, it's not that much money for us to pay their pensions, but we don't want to do it for their whole lives. They said explicitly we would do it for 1 year. So basically they'll just use them to orchestrate the coup and then send them back out without their pensions. And that type of relationship to fascist bands is also part of what we saw in both Italy and in Germany. One of the most succinct summaries of that was given by Ernest Mandel. He said that between 1928 and 1938, the wage sum in Germany remained exactly the same. So for workers, wages were not going up in Germany, but profits increased by 300%. That was the function of fascism in a nutshell. So one of the difficulties that the capitalist ruling class has in mobilizing vigilante bands for a project that is ultimately anti-worker is how do they keep those vigilante bands mobilized when the project itself is going against their best interest. That also, of course, creates a wedge for people like us in order to agitate and bring people away from fascist orientations by explaining that, yes, there are social problems, there are economic problems, but the cause of those problems aren't the ones that the capitalist ruling class says are the cause of those problems. There were a lot of other very rich questions. I think just in the interest of time, though, I might transition into, I'd like to kind of reframe some of the things that we've talked about and then anticipate a little bit of what we're going to be moving into. And I thought that the best way of doing this would be to foreground the ways in which the liberal state under capitalism functions along with various parallel structures. And that one of the things that's important to understand is that the liberal state is not what it appears to be, right? The liberal state proclaims freedom and equality for all, but in actual reality, of course, everybody, I think, or most people know that that is only for a small percentage of the population. What this means is that the liberal state is very invested in political theater, in saying what it's saying one thing and doing something else, in producing an image of itself that actually contradicts how it really functions. And the spectacle of politics is one fundamental way in which it produces an image that is distinct from the ways in which it works behind the scenes with vigilantes, with organized crime, with fascist networks that discipline labor, that beat back insurgent movements, and other such things. So I do think it's important, and actually I know there were a number of references to George Jackson in the chat. There's a very interesting kind of not direct, but indirect debate between Angela Davis and George Jackson. Angela Davis in 1973, in a keynote that she gave that was published on Black Agenda Report, I think within the last few months, said that, well, the United States is not fascist because I'm giving this lecture. And in a certain sense, I think that that is true in one very precise sense. That is that there are bourgeois rights for certain sectors of the population within the liberal state. And those sectors of the population are often those, of course, who are from a particular economic background or a particular racial identity. They tend to be those communities that can be ruled by consent or over which hegemony can be exercised. And identifying the bourgeois state as providing rights for certain sectors of the population is unbelievably important. And defending those rights and trying to expand them while recognizing, of course, that at the end of the day, the bourgeois state is never going to basically alleviate the forms of exploitation and oppression that are operative under capitalism, but we can make enormous gains. So what I'll return to this in a moment, but I think it's important not to take the kind of ultra-leftist position that just says, well, the bourgeois state in its totality is something that needs to be rejected because look at how they aid and abet fascism, et cetera, et cetera. I'll return to this in a moment. But what Jackson had claimed, of course, in Blood in My Eye, is that the US state is fascist through and through. It's the Fourth Reich. And at a certain level, I think that he was right about that as well, in one precise sense, that there are sectors of the US population that are governed, like the population that he was part of, poor, working, Black people and people of color, by modes of governance that should be identified as fascistic. Maybe not identical to what we saw in Germany and Italy, but fascistic in this kind of more expansive sense. And so I think that we can and should hold two thoughts in our mind at the same time, that the bourgeois state, insofar as it does actually recognize and respect the rights of citizens, should be defended and even expanded, while we should also recognize that there are people who have no right to rights, and that just falling into a kind of collapsed version in which you have to say, well, it's completely fascist or absolutely anti-fascist, is a very kind of clunky conceptual framework for a much more complex set of modes of governance that target different populations in various ways. This logic of dual governance, then, I think is really important for the way that the liberal state tends to function in shoring up and maintaining and often intensifying capitalist social relations, because it creates plausible deniability for the state, right? If the state can outsource repressive violence to vigilante organizations, to organized crime and other such networks, then it can say that it's not doing it itself, and it can maintain the political theater of liberal rule. And it can even posture as being opposed to these illegal movements in various ways, while nonetheless generally allowing them to act with impunity. Of course, there are certain contradictions and moments in time in which there have been right-wing extremists who have been prosecuted, served jail time and other things. But when you compare that to left-wing organizers, of course, I think we all recognize the unbelievable disparity. And it's also one of the ways in which the liberal state will then mobilize a kind of repressive reserve army of the unemployed, of the disenfranchised, of the lumpen proletariat to do their bidding in various ways. In relationship to the questions of kind of tactics and strategies for pushing back against both the lies of the liberal state, but also how it does preserve certain rights, as well as these parallel structures, I think there are a few things that we should have in mind. One is, and again, this is to push back against the kind of the risk of an ultra-leftist just complete condemnation of any bourgeois state as defending capitalism and therefore needing to be abolished. At a strategic level, I think that that's true. Like, if we really want to abolish capitalism, then we need to abolish the bourgeois state. But at a tactical level, in the immediate here and now, there is a very strong case to be made for legal class struggle that defends and pushes for the expansion of liberal rights. And as well, that pushes back against the risk of the liberal state preferring the open dictatorship of capital. Another way of putting that is, I think it's important as organizers to take full advantage of the contradiction of liberalism, right? The liberal state says it's doing one thing and is obviously doing other things. But if we can work in that contradiction and say, let's make the liberal state do what it says it's going to do, which is defend the rights of those who abide by the law, etc., then there's a lot of work to be done on that front. And of course, our comrades in Denver and the struggle on that front would be one very good example of this, but there are many, many other such instances. The second thing I'd like to highlight is that political education and agitation need to demonstrate that the liberal state does have this gangster element to it because its ultimate function is in the service of capital, right? And so if we can hold those two thoughts in our minds at the same time, recognize the tactical need to defend rights and work within the extant bourgeois democracies, while also recognizing that strategically, we cannot succumb to the kind of liberal mythology that a capitalist state is ultimately going to recognize the rights of the general population. And this is also, I think, important in relationship to the kind of revolutionary fight back against the fascistic elements that are operative both in the repressive state apparatus and in the parastate apparatus. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to outline some of the various tactics: direct action, united front, the revolutionary communes, etc., which are really integral to the kind of broader fight back. Now, in the 10 or so minutes that I have remaining, I'm going to sum this up relatively quickly, because hopefully a lot of people were able to watch the film on Operation Gladio. I would like to kind of foreground the ways in which the liberal state in defending capitalism has functioned historically in terms of dual modes of governance that target different populations, right? So there are those who are granted rights or whose rights are defended, and there are those who do not have the right to have rights for various reasons, right? They're organizing and fighting back, they're a racialized group, they're an insurgent worker, they're an immigrant, or other such things. But that one of the things that's important to understand how the state actually works is that it's not just the political theater of visible government, it's also the invisible government. And so Operation Gladio gives us a lot of insight into how the US national security state has operated. It's done this as well because these networks that they set up in Europe of the stay-behind armies were massive and probably are ongoing as far as we know. There were some 50 stay-behind network units in Norway, 150 stay-behind armies in Germany, more than 600 in Italy, 3,000 within France. And what was going on in Italy during the strategy of tension, I think, would best be described as an internal civil war. There were 14,500 acts of politically motivated violence. There were 491 people killed. It was a brutal, brutal assault. And from what we know from the archive, the majority of it was the result of fascist underground armies that were overseen, funded, trained, and armed by the US national security state. In this regard, another important part of this is not only the logic of false flag operations, right? So a false flag operation is you commit a heinous crime and then you blame it on somebody else so that they take the fall for it. And so these operations were false flag operations blamed on the communists. But that what this demonstrates as well is that a lot of these sub rosa or clandestine operations also have as one of their goals to intercede within the political theater of electoral politics. And if you paid attention to the interviews with Vincenzo Vinciguera, who is one of the convicted fascists who was serving prison time and has spoken quite frankly, not only in this documentary, but in other interviews about what it is that he was doing, he explains it perfectly well. He says, look, we knew we had to kill women and children. We knew we had to target innocent civilian populations. And the reason for that is that we wanted the voters to support law and order right-wing governments, right? So these operations had multiple goals, right? It was not just to demonize and criminalize the communists who were then rounded up and thrown into prison. It was also to simultaneously galvanize the voting population behind a right-wing law and order government. This is also important in relationship to the history of the US national security state, both domestically and internationally. I think we're all hopefully familiar with COINTELPRO, which of course started before it was officially named and clearly has continued afterwards. And this was an attempt on the part of the FBI to undermine left-wing organizations in the United States. One quite fascinating element from the history of COINTELPRO that I'd like to highlight is that when the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, this was the group of activists who broke in, it's actually very close to where I am now, in Media, Pennsylvania to an FBI office and stole the FBI records and then released them to the general public. They did a percentage, they identified within that FBI office the different types of documentation that were at work, and this is what they found. They found that 1% of FBI records were devoted to organized crime. Right? It's a kind of image into what the real function of the FBI is. 1% of what they were doing, at least according to this office, was overseeing organized crime. 30% were just routine manuals and whatnot. But 40% were dedicated to political surveillance and the like, mainly focused on 200 left or liberal groups. So 40% of their internal documentations, and 14% of it were documents concerning the draft resistance, right? So the idea that that the police, the military, or the national security state is there to protect Americans, to fight organized crime, et cetera. This is one of the dominant myths about both the state and its repressive state apparatus and the national security state apparatus. But the other thing that I wanted to get to in the last 5 or 10 minutes And I made an article that I wrote on precisely this topic available in the supplementary readings if people want to get into the details. I'm going to be very quick on this, but I do think it's important information to people, for people to know. The US national security state was very intimately involved in the redeployment of fascists and Nazis in a literal fascist international in the wake of World War II. A few highlights of this very expansive internationalization of fascism include the following. The Gehlen organization in Germany, Reinhard Gehlen was the head of intelligence services against the Soviet Union and the Eastern Front. He was brought into the US, met all of the major architects of the US national security state, trained by the CIA, and then put in charge of the intelligence services within Germany. He proceeded to hire some 4,000 Nazis in his organization, and they continued to operate with the oversight of the CIA and the complicity of the Adenauer government, which is a so-called centrist government. It was basically right-wing. That was bankrolled by the CIA. And so it's also interesting to see how the US was interested not only in controlling the visible government, but also the intelligence networks of countries like Germany. But the same is true of Italy with Operation Sunrise, in which the future architects of the CIA, Allen Dulles, Angleton, and others, were involved in overseeing the redeployment of fascists from Italy. One of the main figures that they saved actually directly from the communists was Valerio Borghese, known as the Black Prince, because he's one of the leaders of what's called the neo-fascist movement. But there's no reason to call it neo. It's the same thing, and it's the same people doing the same thing in the post-war era, including working with Operation Condor in Latin America. There were some 10,000 Nazis who were allowed to immigrate to the US in the wake of World War II. Operation Paperclip, somebody highlighted on the chat. This brought 1,600 doctors of death from the Nazi war machine into the US, gave them research institutes, and provided them eventually, many of them, with US citizenship if they were able to do the work that they needed to do, which was developing, all of the technologies of warfare that were integral to the US war machine. The case of Japan is very striking because a lot of the fascists in Imperial Japan were literally redeployed and became part of the government in the wake of World War II. Nabusuke Kishi was directly trained by the CIA and put back in power and was the leader of Japan for years. And so that's another clear case. But it's not only that, it's not only the direct fascists and Nazis, it's also that they set up educational forums for this, right? Everybody, I think, is familiar with the School of the Americas, but John Stockwell, a former CIA official, has spoken quite candidly about the public safety program that hired Nazis and fascists to train anti-communist militias globally. The Association for Responsible Dissent, if we look at the kind of consequences of this internationalization of fascism on the part of the US national security state, the Association for Responsible Dissent, which was composed of 14 former CIA officers, including John Stockwell, found that their agency was directly responsible for a minimum of 6 million people being killed globally in 3,000 major and 10,000 minor operations. And so all of this to say that the culturally specific and nationalistic framework that's often given to the analysis of fascism, in which the only question would be, oh, well, is the US government currently led by a self-declared fascist, or is it itself implementing a fascist orientation, leaves out of the analysis the ways in which international forms of fascism have not only been aided and abetted, but directly supported, promoted, trained, etc., by the US national security state, and domestic forms of vigilante violence and fascistic modes of repression have targeted quite systematically particular sectors of the population. And so I realize that we've kind of thrown a lot at you, but I do think that it's important to be able to identify these different dimensions and not collapse them too quickly, right? So just to kind of come full circle, this doesn't mean then that the bourgeois state and its purported defense of rights is something that we should just completely either ignore or claim that its lies go all the way down. that does protect certain sectors of the population. And we should leverage that protection as much as we possibly can in order to build power within the legal frameworks as they exist, while at the same time, of course, recognizing that what the state is actually doing is unleashing this parastate violence against certain sectors of the population, participating very directly in imperialist forms of fascism. And so being able to call those out without just collapsing them into a very simplistic account in which we say it's all one thing or all the other thing, and that's it, which is a big part of a lot of the liberal ideology that dominates particular debates on fascism. I think I'll wrap up there in the interest of time and turn it back over to Claudia for the final wrap up.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you everyone for engaging with this. I think that the call that you're making in terms of not oversimplifying and actually looking into the complexities of how history develops and how it has developed, and this thread of the elements of fascism and how they have operated and continue to operate in our current context is important. It's a very important task for us as revolutionaries, as socialists, to be able to look at the grays in the middle, not only the black and the white, because that's the only thing that they ask us to look at in our traditional ways of thinking about education and the way in which we engage with everything that the ruling class creates for us and imposes on us. So a little bit about next class, which is the last class that we'll be doing together. That doesn't mean it's the last class on fascism. Hopefully people will continue to have more conversations and replicate these conversations again in their branches and their units. Our conversation will be around where do things stand and where do we go, right? We've had these conversations, we've learned about the history, we've tapped into the definitions, the elements, the thread in history. Now, where do we stand and where do we go?
I'd just like to give a shout out. Thanks for all of the contributions. They're extremely thoughtful, and it's wonderful to be able to kind of work through and process this in a collective fashion. And I'm really looking forward to the session next time. I'm extremely pleased that Brian has agreed to come in and talk about the kind of party position. And we really look forward to the questions and comments that you have. And finally, I guess, just seeing this as an ongoing process. There's a lot to figure out and understand, and there's also a lot to do in our organizing endeavors. So thanks for your dedication. And I look forward to seeing you next week for the final class.